Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud while Stoned. Today, we are going to start part 6 of Little Blue Book number 4, titled The Age of Reason by Thomas Paine. As always, The Age of Reason was written in 1792, so the English is kind of flowery, and these and thous and yeas and nays. But, so, without further ado, let's get into it. Starting at the at the top of page 80. Boy, I'm really high. And it came to pass when King Jeroboam heard the saying of the man of God, which had cried against the altar in Bethel, that he put forth his hand from the altar, saying, Lay hold on him. And his hand, which he put out against him, dried up, so that he could not pull it again to him. One would think that such an extraordinary case as this, which is spoken of as a judgment, happened to the chief of one of the parties, and that at the first moment of the separation of the Israelites into two nations would, if it had been true, have been recorded in both histories. But though men in later times have believed all that the prophets have said unto them, it does not appear these prophets or historians believed each other. They know each other too well. A long account is also given in Kings about Elijah. It runs through several chapters and concludes with telling 2 Kings chapter 2 verse 11, and it came to pass as Elijah and Elisha, boy, that's still went on and talked, that behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and parted them both asunder, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. This the author of Chronicles Miraculous, as the story is, makes no mention of, though he mentions Elijah by name, neither does he say anything of the story related in the second chapter of the same book of Kings, of a parcel of children calling Elisha bald head, and that this man of God, verse 24, turned back and looked upon them, and cursed them in the name of the Lord. And there came forth 2 she-bears out of the wood, and tore 42 children of them. He also passes over in silence the story told 2 Kings chapter... Why are they putting these in Roman numerals when they put the other ones in just regular? It's confusing. Okay, that is 13, chapter 13. That when they were burying a man in the sepulchre, when Elijah had been buried, it happened that the dead man, as they were letting him down, verse 21, touched the bones of Elisha, and he, the dead man, revived and stood upon his feet. The story does not tell us whether they buried the man, notwithstanding he revived and stood upon his feet, or drew him up again. Upon all these stories, the writer of Chronicles is as silent as any writer of the present day who did not choose to be accused of lying, or at least of romancing, would be about stories of the same kind. In my observations of the book of Genesis, I have quoted a passage from the 36th chapter, verse 31, which evidently refers to a time after that kings began to reign over the children of Israel. And I have shown that as this verse is verbatim the same as in Chronicles chapter 1, verse 43, where it stands consistently with the order of history, which in Genesis it does not, that the verse in Genesis and a great part of the 36th chapter have been taken from Chronicles, and that the book of Genesis, though it is placed first in the Bible and ascribed to Moses, has been manufactured by some unknown person after the book of Chronicles was written, which was not until at least 860 years after the time of Moses. The evidence I proceed by to substantiate this is regular, and has in it but 2 stages. First, as I have already stated, that the passage in Genesis refers itself for time to Chronicles. Secondly, that the book of Chronicles, to which this passage refers itself, was not begun to be written until at least 860, turning of the page, 860 years after the time of Moses. To prove this, we have only to look into the 13th verse of the 3rd chapter of the first book of Chronicles, where the writer is giving the genealogy of the descendants of David, mentions Zedekiah. And it was in the time of Zedekiah that Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem, 588 years before Christ, and consequently more than 860 years after Moses. Those who have superstitiously boasted of the antiquity of the Bible, and particularly of the books ascribed to Moses, have done it without examination and without any authority than that of one credulous man telling it to another. For so far as historical and chronological evidence applies, the very first book in the Bible is not so ancient as the Book of Homer, but more than 300 years, and is about the same age with Aesop's fables. I am not contending for the morality of Homer, or, on the contrary, I think it a book of false glory, tending to inspire immoral and mischievous notions of honor. And with respect to Aesop, though the moral is in general just, the fable is often cruel, and the cruelty of the fables does more injury to the heart, especially in a child, than the moral does good to the judgment. The only thing that has any appearance of certainty in the book of Ezra is the time in which it was written, which was immediately after the return of the Jews from the Babylonian captivity, about 536 years before Christ. Ezra, who according to the Jewish commentators is the same person as is called Esdras in the Apocrypha, was one of the persons who returned and who, it is also probable, wrote the account of that affair. Nehemiah, whose book follows next to Ezra, was another of the returned persons, and who, it is also probable, wrote the account of the same affair in the book that bears his name. But those accounts are nothing to us, nor to any other persons, unless it be to the Jews, as a part of the history of their nation. And there is just as much of the Word of God in those books as there is in any of the histories of France, or Rapin's history of England, or the history of any other country. But even in matters of historical record, neither of those writers are to be depended upon. In the 2nd chapter of Ezra, the writer gives a list of the tribes and families of the precise number of souls of each that returned from Babylon to Jerusalem. And this enrollment in the persons so returned appears to have been one of the principal objects for writing the book. But in this, there is an error that destroys the intention of the undertaking. The writer begins his enrollment in the following manner. Chapter 2, verse 3. The children of Parosh, 2,174. Verse 4. The children of Shephatath, 372. And in this manner he proceeds through all the families. And in the 64th verse he makes a total, and says that the whole congregation together was 40,2,303 score. But whenever you take the trouble of casting upon the several particulars, you'll find that the total is but 29,818, so that the error is 12,542. What certainly, then, can there be in the Bible for anything? Nehemiah, in like manner, gives a list of the returned families, and of the number of each family. He begins, as in Ezra, by saying, chapter 2, verse 8, the children of Parosh, 3,372, and so on through all the families. The list differs in several of the particulars from that of Ezra. In the 66th verse, Nehemiah makes a total and says, as Ezra had said, the whole congregation together was 40,2,303 score. But the particulars of this list make a total of but 31,089, so that the error here is 11,271. These writers may do well enough for Bible makers, but not for anything where truth and exactness is necessary. The next book in course is the book Esther. If Madame Esther thought it any honor to offer herself as a kept mistress to, I love these names, Ahasuerus, Ahasuerus, or as a rival to Queen Vashti, who had refused to come to a drunken king in the midst of a drunken company, to be made a show of. For the account says, they had been drinking 7 days and were merry. Let Esther and Mordecai look to that. It is no business of ours, at least it is none of mine, besides which the story has a great deal the appearance of being fabulous and is also anonymous. I pass on to the book of Job. The book of Job differs in character from all the books we have hitherto passed over. Treachery and murder make no part of this book. It is the meditations of a mind strongly impressed with the vicissitudes of human life, and by turns sinking under and struggling against the pressure. It is a highly wrought composition between willing submission and involuntary discontent, and shows man, as he sometimes is, more disposed to be resigned than he is capable of being patient. Patience has but a small share in the character of the person of whom the book treats. On the contrary, his grief is often impetuous, but he still endeavors to keep a guard upon it, and seems determined in the midst of accumulating ills to impose upon himself the hard duty of contentment. I have spoken in a respectful manner of the book of Job in the former part of the Age of Reason, but without knowing at that time what I have learned since, which is that from all the evidence that can be collected, the book of Job does not belong in the Bible. I have seen the opinion of 2 Hebrew commentators, Abenzra and Spinoza, upon this subject. They both say that the book of Job carries no interval evidence of being a Hebrew book, that the genesis of the composition, the drama of the piece, are not Hebrew, that it has been translated from another language into Hebrew, and that the author of the book was a Gentile, that the character represented under the name of Satan, which is the first and only time his name is mentioned in the Bible, does not correspond to any Hebrew idea, and that the 2 convocations which the deity is supposed to have made of those whom the poem calls sons of God, and the familiarity with this supposed Satan is stated to have with the deity are in the same case. It may also be observed that the book shows itself to be the production of a mind cultivated in science, which the Jews, so far from being famous for, were very ignorant of. The illusion of the objects of natural philosophy are frequent and strong, and are of a different cast to anything in the books known to the Hebrew. The astronomical names Pleiades, Orion, and Arcturus, yeah, and Greek are Greek and not Hebrew names, and it does not appear from anything that is to be found in the Bible that the Jews knew anything of astronomy, or that they studied it. They had no translation of those names into their own language, but adopted the names as they found them in the poem. That the Jews did translate the literary productions of the Gentile nations into a Hebrew language and mix them with their own is not a matter of doubt. The 31st chapter of Proverbs is an evidence of this. It is there said, verse 1, the word of King Lemuel, the prophet, which his mother taught him. This verse stands as a preface to the Proverbs that follow, and which are not the Proverbs of Solomon, but of Lemuel. And this Lemuel was not one of the kings of Israel, nor of Judah, but of some other country, and consequently a Gentile. The Jews, however, have adopted his proverbs, and as they cannot give any account who the author of the book of Job was, or how they came by the book, and as it differs in writing from the Hebrew writings, and stands totally unconnected with any other book and chapter in the Bible before it and after it, it has all the circumstantial evidence of being originally a book of the Gentiles. The Bible makers and those regulators of time, the chronologists and those regulators of time chronologists appear to have at a loss where to place or how to dispose of the book of Job, for it contains no one historical circumstance nor allusion to any that might serve to determine its place in the Bible. But it would not have answered the purpose of these men to have informed the world of their ignorance, and therefore they have affixed it to the area of 1,520 years before Christ, which is during the time of the Israelites were in Egypt, and for which they have just as much authority and no more than I should have for saying it was 1,000 years before that period. The probability, however, is that it is older than any book in the Bible, and it is the only one that can be read without indignation and disgust. Pause for hydration. We know nothing of what the ancient Gentile world, as it is called, was before the time of the Jews, whose practice has been to culminate and blacken the character of all other nations. And it is from the Jewish accounts that we have learned to call them heathens. But as far as we know to the contrary, they were a just and moral people, and not addicted, like the Jews, to cruelty and revenge, but of whose profession of faith we are unacquainted. It appears to have been their custom to personify both virtue and vice by statues and images, as is done nowadays both by statuary and by painting. But it does not follow from this that they worship them any more than we do. I pass on to the book of Psalms, of which it is not necessary to make much observation. Some of them are moral, and others are very revengeful, and the greater part relate to certain local circumstances of the Jewish nation at the time that they were written, with which we have nothing to do. It is, however, an error or an imposition to call them the Psalms of David. They are a collection of song books, are nowadays from different songwriters who lived at different times. The 137th Psalm could not have been written till more than 400 years after the time of David, because it was written in commemoration of an event, the captivity of the Jews in Babylon. One page turning. Which did not happen till that distance of time. By the rivers of Babylon we sat down. We wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof, for there they had carried us away captive, required of us a song, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. As a man would say to an American, or to a Frenchman, or to an Englishman, sing us one of your American songs, or of your French songs, or of your English songs. This remark, with respect to the time this psalm was written, is of no other use than to show, among others already mentioned, the general imposition the world has been under, with respect to the authors of the Bible. No regard has been paid to time, place, and circumstance, and the names of persons have been affixed to the several books, which it was as impossible they should write as that a man should walk in procession at his own funeral. The book of Proverbs is next. Cottonmouth is kicking in pretty good. Alrighty. The book of Proverbs. These, like the Psalms, are a collection, and that from authors belonging to other nations than those of the Jewish nation, as I have shown in the observations upon the book of Job, besides which some of the proverbs ascribed to Solomon did not appear till 250 years after the death of Solomon. For it is said in the first verse of the 25th chapter, These are also proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah king of Judah copied out. It was 250 years from the time of Solomon to the time of Hezekiah. When a man is famous and his name is abroad, he is made the putative father of things he never said or did, and this most probably has been the case with Solomon. It appears to have been the fashion at that day to make proverbs, as it is now to make jest books and father them upon those who never saw them. The book of Ecclesiastes, or the Preacher, is also ascribed to Solomon, and that with much reason, if not with truth. It is written as the solitary reflection of a worn-out debauch, such as Solomon was, who, looking back on scenes he can no longer enjoy, cries out, "All is vanity." A great deal of the metaphor of the sentiment is obscured, but probably by translation. But enough is left to show that they were strongly pointed in the original. From what is transmitted to us of the character of Solomon, he was witty, ostentatious, desolate, and at last melancholy. He lived fast and died, tired of the world, at the age of 58 years. Wow. 700 wives and 300 concubines are worse than none. And however it may carry with it the appearance of heightened enjoyment, it defeats all the felicity of affection by leaving it no point to fix upon. Divided love is never happy. This was the case with Solomon. And if he could not, with all his pretensions to wisdom, discover it beforehand, he merited, unpitied, the mortification he afterwards endured. In this point of view, his preaching is unnecessary, because to know the consequence, it is only necessary to know the cause. 700 wives and 300 concubines would have stood in place of the whole book. It was needless, after this, to say that all was vanity and vexation of spirit, for it is impossible to derive happiness from the company of those whom we derive of happiness. To be happy in old age, it is necessary that we accustom ourselves to objects that can accompany the mind all the way through life, and that we take the rest as good in their day. The mere man of pleasure is miserable in old age, and the mere drudge in business is not little better. Whereas natural philosophy, mathematical and mechanical science are a continual source of tranquil pleasure, and in spite of the gloomy dogmas of priests and of superstition, the study of those things is the study of true theology. It teaches man to know and admire the Creator, for the principles of science are in creation, and are unchangeable, and of divine origin. Those who knew Benjamin Franklin will recollect that his mind was ever young, his temper ever serene. Science, that never grows gray, was always his mistress. He was never without an object, for when we cease to have an object, we become like an invalid in an hospital waiting for death. Solomon's songs are amorous and foolish enough, but which wrinkled fanaticism has called divine. The compilers of the Bible have placed these songs after the book of Ecclesiastes, and the chronologists have affixed to them the area of 1014 years before Christ, at which time Solomon, according to the same chronology, was 19 years of age, and was then forming his seraglio of wives and concubines. The Bible makers and chronologists should have managed this matter a little better, and either have said nothing about the time, or chosen a time less inconsistent with the supposed divinity of those songs. For Solomon was then in the honeymoon of 1,000 debaucheries. In the honeymoon of 1,000 debaucheries. That should be on a t-shirt. "4 o'clock, the dark tea time of the soul, in the honeymoon of the 1,000 debaucheries." See, genius. Alright, I digress. It should also have occurred to them that as he wrote, if he did write the book of Ecclesiastes, long after these songs, and in which he exclaims that all is vanity and vexation of spirit, that he included those songs in that description. This is the more probable because he says, or somebody for him, Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 8, I got me men singers and women singers, most probably to sing those songs, and musical instruments of all sorts. And behold, verse 11, all was vanity and vexation of spirit. The compilers, however, have done their work, but by halves. For as they have given us the songs, they should have given us the tunes that we might sing them. The books called the books of the prophets fill up all the remaining parts of the Bible. They are 16 in number, beginning with Isaiah and ending with Malachi, of which I have given you a list in my observations upon Chronicles. Of these 16 prophets, all of whom, except the 3 last, lived within the time the books of Kings and Chronicles were written. 2 only, Isaiah and Jeremiah, are mentioned in the history of those books. I shall begin with those 2, reserving what I have to say on the general character of the men called prophets to another part of the work. Whoever will take the trouble of reading the book ascribed to Isaiah will find it one of the most wild and disorderly compositions ever put together. It has neither beginning, middle, nor end, and except a short historical part and a few sketches of history in 2 or 3 of the first chapters, is one continued, incoherent, bombastical rant, full of extravagant metaphor without application and destitute of... He really likes the book. Destitute of venting? That can't be right. Nope, that's not right. Come on, pages. And destitute of meaning. A schoolboy would scarcely have been excusable for writing such stuff. It is, at least in translation, that kind of composition and false taste that is properly called prose run mad. The historical part begins at the 36th chapter and is continued to the end of the 39th chapter. It relates to some matters that are said to have passed during the reign of Hezekiah, king of Judah, at which time Isaiah lived. This fragment of history begins and ends abruptly. It has not the least connection with the chapter that precedes it, nor with that which follows it, nor with any other in the book. It is probable that Isaiah wrote this fragment himself, because he was an actor in the circumstances it treats of. But, except this part, there are scarcely 2 chapters that have any connection with each other. One is entitled at the beginning of the first verse, The Burden of Babylon, another, The Burden of Moab, another, The Burden of Damascus, another, The Burden of Egypt, another, The Burden of the Desert of the Sea, another, The Burden of the Valley of Vision. As you would say, the story of the night of the burning mountain, the story of Cinderella, or the children of the wood, etc., etc. I like this guy. Just saying. I have already shown in the instances of the last 2 verses of Chronicles, and the 3 first in Ezra, that the compilers of the Bible mixed and confounded the writing of different authors with each other, which alone, were there no other cause, is sufficient to destroy the authenticity of any compilation, because it is more than presumptive evidence that the compilers are ignorant who the authors were. A very glaring instance of this occurs in the book ascribed to Isaiah. The latter part of the 44th chapter and the beginning of the 45th, so far from having been written by Isaiah, could only have been written by some person who lived at least 150 years after Isaiah was dead. These chapters are a compliment to Cyrus, who permitted the Jews to return to Jerusalem from the Babylonian captivity to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple, as it's stated in Ezra. The last verse of the 44th chapter and the beginning of the 45th are in the following words. That saith of Cyrus, He is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, Thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundations shall be laid. Thus saith the Lord to his anointed in Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden to subdue nations before him, and I will loose the lions of I will loose the loins of king, to open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. I will go before thee, etc. What audacity of church and priestly ignorance it is to impose this book upon the world as the writing of Isaiah, when Isaiah, according to their own chronology, died soon after the death of Hezekiah, which was 698 years before Christ, and a decree of Cyrus in favor of the Jews returning to Jerusalem was, according to the same chronology, 536 years before Christ, which was a distance of time between the two of 162 years. I do not suppose that the compilers of the Bible made these books, but rather that they picked up some loose anonymous essays and put them together under the names of such authors as best suited their purpose. They have encouraged the imposition, which is next to inventing it, for it was impossible, but they must have observed it. And that's where we're going to stop. And that will be the end of part 6. Oops, there we go. Look how, man, I'll bake my eyes, look. Alright, that's the end of part 6 of The Age of Reason by Thomas Paine. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 7.